Okay, so we're going to have a little look at this essay. So given this title here, I'm expecting a definition of inflation. We've got to talk about how these indices are made, so that will be something about a basket of goods, something about different goods in the basket having different weights, and then something about it being added together and calculating the percentage change in the index, which would then be a measure of inflation. We then might talk about the difference between the RPI and the CPI, and possibly go on to some limitations of index numbers such as these. So to start off with, looks good. We've got a definition of inflation there, and that's what I'd expect right at the start of the essay. Okay, so looking at this paragraph, we've got the bit about a shopping basket here, which is good. We've got a little bit about weighting here. We've got what determines the value of the weights, although it's quite complicated, quite textbooky. Could just give a simple example of something that was more of consumer expenditure than something else and say it would have a heavier weight. Weights are updated, that's okay. Wasn't quite sure about this sentence. The CPI is a measure of the total cost of that shopping basket and only measures that change in price of this basket and not price levels. Well, the whole point of the CPI is to get an approximation of the change in the overall price level by looking at a basket of goods. So not quite sure what point that particular sentence there was trying to make. Yeah, again, this sentence here is a bit complex. I'd just be talking about we have a basket of goods, and I discuss how the basket was made up. Then I talk about the weights. Then I talk about the weights going into an index number, and then I talk about the percentage change in the index number being inflation. And this bit here, I think it's just sort of losing focus a little bit. This is actually better, inflation's percentage change in the index, that's correct again. Yes, that's okay. I mean, it's obviously 112.4, so that should have been 112.4, and then that 12.4, so this number doesn't quite sit with the other two numbers there. Okay, last bit on the difference between the RPI and the CPI is correct. So in terms of the things I was looking at, we just go back to the top of this essay. We've got the definition of inflation, which was right. In here we've got a bit on weights, a bit on the basket of goods, a bit on how they move to an overall index. Given I've talked about three things there, this should really be three paragraphs. I'm not sure why we've got a monster paragraph there. At the bottom here, we've got a little bit on the RPI and CPI. So the only thing we're missing perhaps is the limitations of this process, how a particular family may have a different set of weights and this may not reflect their value of inflation, how there may be some calculation errors. We saw some limitations when we watched the rather portly Greek gentleman and his YouTube channel on the board in a lesson. So we're on to part B, inflation and deflation. Is inflation better than deflation? Nice simple question. Okay, so good, strong, accurate opening paragraph. We've defined both concepts. Only thing I'd say is, annual inflation was 3%. It's gone from £1 to 103. That's all correct, but it's not a good. Obviously, inflation, really should be referring to a basket of goods or goods as a whole rather than a particular good. So although that's not incorrect, it's a bit misleading and goes a little bit against the grain of what inflation is overall. Okay, so we're going on inflation here. This bit I found a bit overcomplicated because we've got, inflation, which comes from AD going rightwards. Then leads to people bringing purchases forward. AD goes further rightwards. I think that was at one more step than we needed. We could simply have gone for the advantage of, higher real national output and then higher employment, but the disadvantage of a higher price level. This was not untrue, but it's a sort of a step more and more complicated than we really needed. So this bit here is okay. This is evaluation. Basically AD going to the right is bad if we've already got inflation. but if previously we were in a slump, then a little bit of an AD increase and a little bit of inflation might be okay. So to make that really good and get lots of marks, I might have started with to evaluate, just to signal to the examiner that I was doing some evaluation. The bit that's a bit strange here is, as soon as we mention deflation here, for me that's screaming new paragraph. We're on to a completely different topic, so we need a new paragraph. The bit here about deflation causing people to postpone consumption decisions and us having a sort of downward recessionary cycle is good, but that could have been developed in more depth. The effect on expectations and the timing of purchase decisions is more important for deflation than inflation, and I'd probably have tied this into the Japanese experience in the 1990s, and indeed Japan is still finding it very difficult to get out of that kind of deflationary spiral. Okay, so looking at this paragraph here, interesting way of tackling it. You've sort of had the issue, competitiveness, and then you've talked about the effect of inflation and the effect of deflation. That's fine, it's a valid approach. I'd probably have done adds and disads of inflation and then adds and disads of deflation, just because it's easier to separate the issues out. So this is all correct, but it's quite a chunky paragraph for somebody to take in. Okay, so here we can't say the value of money is affected by inflation, because effectively, the change in the value of money is the definition of inflation or deflation. It's not an effect, it's simply what inflation is or what deflation is. And we then move on to some other issues. There's more we could have discussed here distributionally. If we have inflation, it erodes the value of wealth, so it reduces the gap between the very wealthy and those who haven't got wealth stored. If we have deflation, obviously any money in the bank becomes worth more, and therefore the wealthier would gain more and the poor without savings wouldn't gain. So deflation would potentially worsen the distribution of income. Inflation in some ways may actually reduce the distribution of wealth. Sorry, I was a bit imprecise there. Deflation would increase the differences in the distribution of wealth rather than income. Okay, so relative poverty will be the income of one group relative to another. So if prices halve, because we've got deflation, prices halve for both. So the absolute income of each group doubles, and relative to each other, they've got exactly the same percentage difference in income. So I'm not sure that deflation would reduce relative poverty. We did say it might reduce differences in the value of wealth. No, it would actually increase differences in the value of wealth. So deflation reducing relative poverty, for me, doesn't really ring true. Okay, so this example we've got here is what I was saying earlier. If we've got inflation, it will hit fixed amounts of money, so it will reduce the income of pensioners, and it will actually also reduce the value of any wealth they have. So a rich pensioner would be really hit by inflation. So in the 1970s, lots of rich pensioners were hit by it, and consequently at the end of the 70s they voted for Thatcher rather than Labour, because they didn't want to see the value of their life savings and their income eroded further. Okay, happy with this paragraph. This is fine. Adjustment of wages is important. What's said there is sensible. It's quite reductive. Okay, so overall slightly mixed feelings. We've got a bit at the start about inflation and deflation. We've got some information on each. I'm not sure we've got the big picture or the complete package. With inflation, the disadvantage is higher prices, maybe loss of international competitiveness, maybe people who've lent money lose out. But the gain is inflation is usually associated with AD going to the right. So demand pull inflation is usually associated with growth in the economy. On the other hand, we could then look at changes in the supply side of the economy. If we get inflation from cost push inflation, i.e. the aggregate supply curve going to the left, that's going to raise the price level and reduce output, so that's almost always bad. So I'd be saying inflation could be good if AD's gone up, could be bad if it's cost push inflation due to AS going down. In terms of deflation, deflation can come for two reasons. It could be because AD's gone to the left, so we're in a recession, so that would be bad. It could be because we've got a more productive economy and AS has gone to the right, and we've got a lower price level and a higher output and more employment, so that could be good. So this part B of the essay, I think, is an incomplete picture for me. The structure's alright, but it doesn't get across the difference between good and bad inflation or good and bad deflation. I think it's a little bit short of examples. We had one example there of Britain in the 1970s. I wanted to hear about Japan. Japan is the classic example of deflation. If not Japan, I think Ireland had a little bit of deflation post the Eurozone crisis and needed some more topical examples. So this part B is okay, sort of top B, low A. I think it's probably a band 4 answer. Band 5 would be very, very good. You'd be looking at an A star, very hard to do that. Middle of band 4, say 19 out of 25 would be an A answer. I think this might be an 18 answer. If we looked at the first part, it's out of 15. It's got most of the material covered. I might be giving that part 12 out of 15. So overall, I might be giving this 30 out of 40, 75B. Difficult because I'm looking at the essay a different way to usual. So I think it's a sound essay. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not outstanding. There is one on frog that you can read. One I think it was written by Graham Sapel last year. I didn't think his was ideal. I thought the part A wasn't all that clear. But he did get 3 A stars in his A levels. Pretty good essay writer, worth a look at. And I guess you could, after watching this video, watch the other 2 videos if you wanted to. So that wasn't too bad in terms of the time it took me.